As a result, Australia is also at war.
It is feared that the Prime Minister has drowned.
He has misled the Parliament.
Welcome to the Political History of Australia podcast.
Any boss who sacks anyone for not turning up the day is a bum.
I will not be lectured by this man.
Why won't you call an early election?
Mate, because I want to do you slowly. I want to do you slowly.
With your host, John Ruddick.
Welcome to the Political History of Australia, Episode 12, Governor Phillip versus Major Ross. Last time we saw the little settlement around Sydney Cove get to the precipice of famine and collapse, but then convict James Roos demonstrated the seemingly magical productivity of privately owned farms. It had been a rocky start, but with the food crisis at least stabilised by mid-1791, confidence slowly grew about the potential of New South Wales. A thumbnail sketch of the New South Wales politics between 1788 and 1810 is this. The military undermined Governor Arthur Phillip until they exhausted him and his health, so he departed in 1792. Governor John Hunter was sent to restore order, but the military undermined him, and he was recalled in some disgrace by London in 1800. The military also undermined the third governor, Philip Gidley King, and his health suffered until he resigned and was replaced by London in 1806. So far, it's a 3-0 win by the military officers over the establishment. The officers were preoccupied with prospering in this embryonic society, and as the wealth and status of the colony grew, so too did their determination to resist the establishment acting as a handbrake on growth. Historians are mostly critical of what they consider to be an era of corruption and greed, but they overlook the physical reality on the ground. Huts, homes, farms, shops, markets, warehouses, roads, bridges and ports all sprung up, seemingly spontaneously, not so much because a governor decreed it so, but because of entrepreneurial drive. New South Wales in its first 22 years was institutionally disorderly but thriving, surely superior to institutional order and hunger. London was not impressed. In their mind, the British Empire was built on the prim and proper administration of law and obedience to authority. Early New South Wales, however, more resembled its contemporary, the American Wild West. So in 1806, London sent out a man with a reputation for discipline and firmness, Governor William Bligh, to get the joint in order. But this time, the military and their wealthy mates arrested the governor and seized power for almost 2 years. The big, massive turning point for early New South Wales was the arrival of Governor Lachlan Macquarie with crack troops in 1810. For the first time, a governor could give an order and it would be strictly enforced. Macquarie has been celebrated ever since, but he had the good fortune of building upon a booming foundation and a now ingrained culture of entrepreneurialism. This episode unpacks the origin of the tension between the two rival visions of early New South Wales. At the time of the founding of Sydney Cove, London was just gearing up for the Pax Britannica. Laying out the foundations of the largest empire in history created a lot of opportunities for young, ambitious men. It was not unexpected that military officers in the colonies would, on the side, make money from developing local industries. Indeed, officers on duty in the colonies were routinely given land grants. So a military posting was a way to get promoted and to build wealth. Today we'd call that corruption, but as long as it wasn't too egregious, it was unremarkable at the time. In the 1790s, Britain had massive Canada with a European population of 170,000, and so Canada was a highly sought-after post for ambitious officers. Canada was much closer to England and far more developed than far away New South Wales, but if Canada was too cold, there was a smorgasbord of colonial choice. The Caribbean was a place of evil cruelty towards slaves. There were around half a dozen European nations with colonies in the Caribbean at this time, but Britain was dominant. Lots of wealth was to be made, plus there were frequent opportunities to distinguish oneself in battle. Then, of course, there was India, what would soon be referred to as the jewel in the crown of the empire. There were only 20,000 British citizens living in India in the 1790s, and there were endless ways to make money. Plus, there were many other British outposts dotted around the globe. Arguably, the least attractive destination was the little convict experiment in New South Wales. So far away, so undeveloped, no chance of excelling on the battlefield, and rather than quick riches, the initial reports were of hunger. To induce military men to volunteer for New South Wales, higher pay was offered. The British Marines, known today as the Royal Marines, were first formed in 1664. They were soldiers, not sailors, but soldiers whose job it was to protect and serve the interests of the Royal Navy. Within a fortnight of the British Cabinet's decision to send the First Fleet in August 1786, a special battalion of Marines was created, the New South Wales Marine Corps. The First Fleet had aboard around 20 Marine officers, 24 non-commissioned officers and 168 privates, plus around 50 family members. The privates of the New South Wales Marine Corps were a mixed bag. The types attracted to serving as convict supervisors were often of a similar social background to the convicts. Many likely had criminal records themselves. The Marine Corps were to maintain law and order aboard the First Fleet and then law and order in the colony. They were to enforce the subordination of convicts and defend against Aboriginal or foreign attacks. Prisoners in a typical jail sit around bored in their cell or yard all day. The convicts in New South Wales were to be workers who would clear land, build infrastructure and labour on farms, all which required supervision. The mooted local and foreign attacks didn't materialise and convict supervision was boring or beneath the regular Marines, so the Marine Corps officers focused on the other purpose of signing up, land grants and commercial favours. Governor Phillip, however, refused to give the Marine Corps officers land because he wanted them focused on maximising the productivity of convicts. Resentment grew, especially when former convicts and regular Marines began getting free land. In the rival camp was Governor Phillip and his entourage of naval officers, around 40 of them, who were outnumbered by the Marines 5-1. The role of the naval officers was to administer governance in the colony, survey the coastline, explore the interior, maintain the ships, build the docks, deter an invasion from sea, and from time to time sail away to restock supplies. Governor Phillip may have had the commission from the King and the Governor's costume, but in faraway Sydney Cove, the New South Wales Marine Corps had men with guns. Mao Zedong was right about one thing: political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. Phillip's authority was shaky from the start. Resentment was exacerbated by Phillip routinely being lenient towards convict misbehaviour, yet overly strict with the Marine Corps. On the 11th of February 1788, just days after landing, Arthur Bowes, a surgeon, wrote,
"This day Thomas Bramwell, a Marine, got amongst the women and beat one of them, Elizabeth Needham, a most infamous hussy, with whom he had had connections while on board. This day he received 100 lashes and is to have 100 more. One of the convicts who had struck a sentry on duty received only 150 lashes. The severity shown to the Marines and leniency to the convicts has already excited great murmuring and discontent among the corps."
A fortnight later, Bowes wrote again,
"The Governor sent for and severely reprimanded Captain Marshall for allowing his steward to purchase an animal of the squirrel kind from one of the convict men and giving him liquor for it. The Governor took away the animal from Captain Marshall and had the steward punished with 50 lashes. And it appears to many a stretch of the Governor's prerogative to inflict so severe a corporal punishment upon a seaman for a crime which at the time it was committed was not known to be a crime, and without any form of legal trial. I am sorry to say this government, if a government it can be called, is a scene of anarchy and confusion. Discontent prevails among the different officers throughout the settlement. The Marines and sailors are punished with the utmost severity for the most trivial offences, whilst the convicts are pardoned or at most punished in a very slight manner for crimes of the blackest dye. What will be the result of such an inconsistent and partial mode of acting time, and I may venture to say a very short time will show."
Phillip's approach paid off with the convicts, who generally behaved better than expected, but the knock-on effect was tense relations with the Marine officers. The first power struggle in Australian politics was between Governor Arthur Phillip and Major Robert Ross. That tussle shaped the character of the colony for its first 22 years. So, who was Major Robert Ross? He was the boss of the New South Wales Marine Corps. This made him also the second in command of the entire colony, the Lieutenant Governor. If Phillip died, protocol would elevate Ross to Governor. In short, Governor Phillip was, in the eyes of the British establishment and of the historical consensus since, the quote-unquote hero of the period. Ross is the anti-hero. But as we will see, there is usually two sides to a story. Phillip's best mate, the judge advocate David Collins, wrote of his inexpressible hatred for Ross. Ralph Clark, an officer in the Marines, said Ross was, without exception, the most disagreeable commanding officer I ever knew. This line is oft quoted, but not the fact that Ross and Clark's relationship did improve with time. Historian Alan Clark referred to Ross as, quote, a narrow-minded, censorious, self-important, and almost totally humourless human being. Perhaps this assessment is mostly accurate, but perhaps not. Almost all we know of Ross is accounts written from Phillip and his confidants, plus a few grumpy letters from Ross. Ross was born in Scotland in 1740. We know nothing of his family, so they were likely poor. He joined the Marines at 16. He saw action at the famous Battle of the Plains of Abraham, which captured Quebec in the 7 Years' War, and then Bunker Hill, the opening scene of the American Revolution, where Ross commanded a company of grenadiers. Soon after the Cabinet's decision to send the First Fleet, Ross volunteered for the New South Wales Marine Corps. It was the biggest error of his promising career. He was promoted to Major and so became the military boss of New South Wales. It was an impressive promotion, backed by senior figures, which indicates Ross had impressed so far in his career. Tension between Phillip and Ross began early. Ross disagreed with Phillip's choice of Sydney Cove as the spot to build the colony, claiming it would, quote, never answer. This story is retold to demonstrate Ross was from the outset grumpy and pessimistic. But 2 years later, Phillip admitted if he could have a do-over, he'd have chosen Parramatta to kick things off. So it is possible Ross wasn't just being recalcitrant. Maybe he was just correct. As 2IC of the colony, Ross's residence was the second brick house built in the colony, but it collapsed during a storm. Ross was uninjured, but it was a bad omen. In July 1788, Ross wrote to London complaining of Phillip.
Has never done me the honour of informing me of his opinions or asking me for mine.
In November 1788, a frustrated Ross wrote to London again complaining that Phillip communicates nothing to any person here but his secretary. They were at this time heading for near famine-like conditions. Perhaps Ross's criticism had some merit. In mid-1789, Ross wrote this time directly to Phillip.
Will you please explain to me the line of conduct which, as Lieutenant Governor of this settlement, you wish me either to preserve or follow, assuring yourself that I shall endeavour to pursue that line, at least till such time as a power superior to either of us shall determine the bounds of both and redress our grievances. At present, I acknowledge myself as much in the dark with respect to the line of conduct you expect me to pursue as Lieutenant Governor, or what you expect from me, or what I shall do, as I was the first day of our meeting in London.
In recent years, Professor Gary Sturgis has written about Ross after gaining access to previously unknown archival documents. He writes,
it would be easy to conclude Phillip's failure to consult arose from a lack of respect for his opinions. But David Collins, who as the governor's official secretary would become Phillip's closest confidant, also complained about Phillip's failure to communicate. Lieutenant William Dawes wrote that Phillip was so close and mysterious that it is impossible to understand clearly what he means even on the most trifling subjects.
Many historians claim Phillip expected a key role of the Marines was to oversee convict labour and help administer the criminal court. But, they claim, Ross insisted their job was strictly limited to guarding convicts at night and no more. This is supposedly evidence that Ross was lazy and insubordinate. Professor Gary Sturgis, however, writes that this is an inaccurate picture.
The Marines made a significant contribution to maintaining order in the early settlement, but it was never intended they would be convict overseers, directly supervising the work parties or managing the camps. And with the establishment of the Night Watch in August 1789, staffed entirely by convicts, they no longer had a significant role in keeping the peace. But Ross had responsibilities over and above those of a commandant of Marines. On first arrival, he was given responsibility for managing the people on the western side of the stream, later to be named the Tank Stream. The Marine camp was located on the west side, but the majority of the convicts were also housed there. So for the first year or so, Ross bore a great deal of responsibility for governing them as well. He conducted criminal investigations and offered indemnities to offenders in return for evidence. He sat as a justice of the peace in committal hearings, sentenced minor offenders and oversaw their punishment. He exercised ultimate control over some of the convict work assignments and managed the convict overseers he appointed to supervise their camps. Ross was actively involved in the establishment of the Night Watch, and he placed a great deal of trust in Herbert Keeling, the convict appointed as its first overseer. The Marines were also given responsibility for governing the new settlement at Rose Hill, now Parramatta, once it was established in November 1788, and while Ross never visited, this represented another distinct area of control.
It was Ross, not Phillip, who was encouraging of the convicts to set up their own little enterprises after labouring for the day. A lifelong naval man like Phillip was oblivious to the upside of cottage private industry. Historian Alan Atkinson, in his first volume of his series The Europeans in Australia, argues,
"There was more to Ross than meets the eye. He had his own ideas, and like many who argue fruitlessly with power, his ideas represented an undercurrent of thought which was to rise to the surface in due course. He was a lesser man than Phillip, but his vision of the settlement was the first alternative vision. The management of men and women brought by the First Fleet involved their responding to the crisis of choice, and it was Ross who first considered how choice might be negotiated among the subject people. There were some fundamental problems of settlement which Ross thought about more carefully than Phillip."
In Phillip's mind, he was saddled with an insubordinate deputy and lazy Marines. Some Marines stole food. To teach them a lesson, Phillip publicly executed one of the ringleaders. When 6 Marines guarding a food store stole from it, Phillip hanged them all. That was a negative turning point for the already sour relationship. Ross now encouraged his Marines to refuse to serve on the criminal court, which undermined Phillip's hopes of establishing a proper legal system. It got so bad, Phillip appointed one of the best behaved convicts to stand guard over the Marines to prevent them from stealing. Ross complained so ferociously that Phillip backed down despite the arrangement apparently working well. On the 15th of May 1788, the first ship of the First Fleet returned to England, and it carried a letter from Phillip to London officials. He wrote,
"Major Ross is a man who cannot bear contradiction. The officers of the detachment have behaved with great propriety, but the want of more authority over the non-commissioned officers and privates is much felt."
Phillip's letters to London complaining of Ross kept coming. At one point he wrote,
"I am very sorry to be under the very disagreeable necessity of troubling your lordship with the following particulars, from the discontents between the commandant and the officers. I am sorry to say it is not in my power to restore that harmony which is so very requisite in our situation."
Ross in turn wrote repeatedly to London undermining Phillip. London officially sided with Phillip, but an examination of the replies to some of these letters indicates there was some sympathy for Ross. There's little doubt Phillip's shunning of Ross made Ross bitter and pessimistic about the colony in general. At one point he wrote,
"If I could, I possibly have imagined that I was to be served with, for instance, no more butter than any of the convicts. I most certainly would not have left England."
Ross wrote to Evan Nepean, a key official in London, on the 16th of November 1788.
"In the whole world, there is not a worse country than what we have yet seen of this. All that is contiguous to us is so very barren and forbidding, that it may with truth be said, here nature is reversed, and if not so, she is nearly worn out. For almost all the seed we have put in the ground has rotted, and I have no doubt, but will continue to do so. From the little we have seen of the country, and the few opportunities we have had of gaining any knowledge of its inhabitants, it does not appear to me to be by any means a desirable place for any person to come to with the hopes of making a fortune, or even with a desire of remaining in it longer than they are absolutely obliged to do so. I believe every person, let their ideas of its being a good country, who came out with a desire of remaining in it, are now most earnestly wishing to get away from it."
And then Ross's frustration spilled over into bickering with his own Marine officers. At one point, Ross arrested 5 of them over a seemingly trivial matter. Phillip wrote to Lord Sydney.
The strength of the Marine detachment consists of only 18 officers, one of whom is on duty at Norfolk Island, and a second has never done any duty since he was appointed by Major Ross. Of the 16 remaining for the duty of the settlement, 5 have been put under arrest by the Commandant, and are only doing duty till a general court-martial can be assembled.
By mid-1789, London had had enough. They sided with Phillip and decided to withdraw the New South Wales Marine Corps entirely and replace them with a new force, the New South Wales Corps. The New South Wales Marine Corps had been military men in the service of the Navy. The New South Wales Corps were Army, but little changed. The phasing out and replacement of the New South Wales Marine Corps began with the arrival of the Second Fleet in mid-1790, and it would be completed in around 18 months. As the New South Wales Marine Corps regular troops prepared to depart, Phillip would offer them land as an inducement to stay, but he maintained a veto over officers getting any land. When the Second Fleet began arriving, it included Captain William Hill, who was acutely distressed to learn Governor Phillip was giving land grants to ex-convicts, but not to officers like himself. Hill wrote a letter stating,
"In America, the officers and settlers had grants of land in proportion to their rank, but those of the Marines who are now here and have borne every hardship have no such thing. In my humble opinion, there can be nothing more impolite. Industry is the first essential to the welfare of any kingdom. Consequently, all measures adopted to promote it are highly commendable. And I am well persuaded that Britain will not thank our governor for acting, not only on a mean, but on an unstable plan, to the great disquiet of every individual in the colony."
As we saw in episode 10, Philip Gidley King, one of Governor Phillip's trusted naval officers, was dispatched to Norfolk Island within weeks of the First Fleet's arrival, with instructions to get a second settlement up and running. 2 years later, Governor Phillip decided to send King to London to give a first-hand account of what was happening in New South Wales and to plead for more supplies. The vacancy on Norfolk Island was an opportunity for Governor Phillip to get rid of the irritating Ross. So in March 1790, Ross arrived as boss of Norfolk Island. Most historians claim this was Phillip banishing his rival to prevent escalation. Undoubtedly true. But Norfolk Island was also Ross's opportunity to be his own man. Historian Alan Atkinson writes,
"This was a heaven-sent opportunity for Ross to establish his own credentials. Unlike Phillip, who thought about farming no more than necessary, Ross had a fashionable interest in scientific agriculture, which at the time was moving ahead in leaps and bounds. He wanted to try his ideas out."
When Ross had landed on Norfolk Island, the ship was wrecked due to the island being surrounded by reefs and lacking a harbour. All aboard made it to shore, but much of the food went down with the ship. They were now with few supplies and with no ship, cut off from the outside. What to do? Ross declared martial law for a period of 4 months, but lacked authority to do so. So he assembled everyone on the island, including the convict majority, and they all gave a public pledge to accept martial law. This, oddly, was the first demonstration of something approaching democratic consent in Australia. Ross announced to the convicts the Acre Plan, where they would be given their own little lot of land, 1 to 3 acres. They were to clear, cultivate and grow their food as a means of achieving self-sufficiency. Corn, potatoes, wheat and barley were grown on the rich soils. Convicts who produced good crops were rewarded with effective legal title to their land, and Ross introduced prizes for the most impressive yields. Notably, this was prior to the James Roos revolution of the previous episode. At Parramatta, Phillip only allowed free convicts to have their own plot. On Norfolk Island, convicts still under sentence were effectively landholders. Ross explained to London what his thinking was.
While the convicts were sustained by the humanity, I might have said folly, of the government, they will not take the trouble of getting anything for themselves. This mode, I think, will create a desire among them for living better than their neighbours, and that may create industry. An industry, I think, will cultivate a desire of settling for life.
Adam Smith had published the Free Market Bible, The Wealth of Nations, only a decade and a half earlier, and it was a bestseller. It does seem likely Ross had read the work of his fellow Scot. Before long, the Norfolk Islanders were better fed than the mainlanders. Again, however, we have reports of Ross being dictatorial and cruel to the convicts and quarrelling with his officers. There's likely truth to it, but these are reports from the anti-Ross camp. When Ross had arrived in Norfolk Island, he brought with him 281 convicts and Marines, and that increased the population to around 520. But by the time Ross had departed the island 18 months later, its population had more than doubled, with the population just a little less than Sydney. Now, it was around this time that the name Sydney Cove was shortened to Sydney. Seems odd today, but there was even some talk that Norfolk Island should replace Sydney as the lead settlement. This is an impressive performance from Ross, particularly after things looked so dire when he arrived with a wrecked ship. Philip Gidley King returned to Norfolk Island 18 months after his departure and replaced Ross as boss of the island. King arrived and described the agriculture he saw as, quote, a most promising aspect. But regardless, King foolishly wound up the land grant to convicts scheme, and from that point the island went into decline. From 1805 the evacuation of the island commenced, and it was abandoned in 1814, though it would revive in 1824 as a place of punishment for badly behaved convicts. So Ross sailed back to Sydney in November 1791, presumably to resume his role as boss of the New South Wales Marine Corps. Within days of his return, however, Ross got into a duel with an officer of the New South Wales Corps who had earlier quarrelled with Ross on Norfolk Island, Captain William Hill. Hill had been with Ross on Norfolk Island and accused Ross of being excessively cruel to convicts. Hill had made the same complaint about others. On this occasion, Hill accused Ross of coercing a convict to edit a complaint of cruelty to make Ross look more favourable. When Ross was recalled to Sydney and on the ship on the way back from Norfolk Island, an inquiry was conducted by William Hill, a junior officer to Ross. That inquiry found Ross had indeed coerced a witness. Ross was furious a junior officer was investigating him, and so challenged him to a duel when they arrived in Sydney. No one was hurt, but Ross was ordered by Phillip to return to England. Arriving in England, Ross immediately launched a prosecution against an officer of the New South Wales Marine Corps, James Meredith, but Ross was humiliated with a finding that the prosecution had been, quote, groundless and malicious. Ross was then shunned by polite society. A contemporary wrote, that devil Ross has been pretty well mortified on Meredith's court-martial. Ross was then demoted from major to captain and given a lowly role of military recruitment, and died, possibly of shame, 2 years after his return. Ross's legacy is that he left behind a factionalised colony, the governor versus the military. But it was Ross's more laissez-faire spirit, more than Phillip's autocracy, that would dominate until Macquarie's arrival 2 decades later. Governor Phillip had informally asked London if he could return for a period to London in April 1790 to look after his private affairs. That was declined. 2 months later, Phillip wrote privately to his friend Sir Joseph Banks.
My great effort will be made this year, and I hope after all our disappointments that 2 years more will fix this colony beyond the reach of accidents. Though I almost doubt holding on so long for, I find my health declines fast. I have, however, one satisfaction. The more exercise I take, the better I am. My complaint is want of sleep, of which I sometimes don't get more than a few hours in many nights, and at times a severe pain in the side.
Phillip wrote again to London in 1791, officially requesting permission to resign to get medical treatment. That was declined. He wrote again in March 1792, and then a couple more times, at one point stating, the wants of the colony had made it a duty the severest I have ever experienced. London would still not consent. In May 1792, a family friend of Phillip arrived in Sydney, and he wrote to his parents.
Sorry to inform them that Philip was not very well. His health is now very bad. He fatigues himself so much, he won't rest until he is not able to walk.
Finally, on the 7th of October 1792, a ship arrived with a letter informing Phillip the king had agreed to let him return to England. He left on the very next ship. It was the 11th of December 1792. He had served for just under 5 years. He took with him 4 tamed kangaroos. Travelling with him was a marine who wrote, the state of the colony at this present time seems far better than at any time since the settlement was made. One of his first duties on return was to debrief Banks. Phillip claimed to intend to return to New South Wales, but his doctors advised against, and he formally resigned as governor in July 1793. Philip's health improved back in England. He remarried in May 1794, but again unhappily. By 1796, he was appointed command of a Royal Navy ship patrolling the English Channel as a warning to a feared French invasion. He was then promoted to Rear Admiral in 1801 and then a Vice Admiral in 1806. He suffered a stroke in 1808 but recovered, and in 1814 he received a grand promotion to Admiral of the Blue, which must have been no more than a ceremonial promotion as he died a few weeks later. Philip was 75 and he left behind a significant estate. He spent the last few years living in Bath, and he's buried in that city's abbey where a plaque reads,
"Near this tablet are the remains of Arthur Phillip, Esquire, Admiral of the Blue, first Governor and founder of the colony of New South Wales, who died 31st August 1814 in his 76th year. To his indomitable courage, prophetic vision, forbearance, faith, inspiration and wisdom was due the success of the first settlement in Australia at Sydney, 26th of January 1788.
Join us next time when we meet Governor Phillip's interim replacement, Acting Governor Francis Grose, and watch Grose dismantle the old order and let loose a stupendous economic boom.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Political History of Australia podcast with your host, John Ruddick. Click follow to receive episode notifications, and leaving a review helps others find the podcast.